Hello, everyone. Today I am here with a repeated guest. I think this is like the fourth time I've had you on my channel, and it's Allan Gunnells. Would you like to give yourself a an introduction?
I am Allan Gunnells. I do keep coming back. I just can't stay away from Jason. So, but yeah, I'm a writer who's been publishing for a little over 10 years in the small press, and I always love to come and talk with Jason because he is a very knowledgeable source of horror information.
I'm glad you think so. um, some you, talking to you because we talked a few times on the Darkness Dwells podcast as well, and so after a few years of this, you start to feel a little bit like we're kind of like friends almost now.
Well, I mean, I like to think so. I mean, you think we're just almost.
I was just trying to sneak that in, to make sure, just in case you were like, what?
But yeah, I always
Friends?
love talking to you, whether it's on a podcast or just online, because
Yeah.
we always have interesting conversations about the horror scene.
Yeah, we do. Even on Messenger, every once in a while, I'll get a Allan Gunnells message saying, "So, how you doing?"
Well, I like to check in now and again.
About a year ago, I think one of the first times I had you on the Jason's Weird Reads here, you recommended a writer to me. I believe it was Brian Hodge. You were talking to me about his short stories, and so I went and read a few of his short stories, and I was really surprised. Uh, Not because you recommended something good to me, but I wasn't expecting what I got from his stories. I almost had felt like a modern day American style Robert Aikman,
Yeah.
and that I wasn't expecting that whatsoever. So thank you for recommending that to me. That was really really good.
Well, I'm glad you checked him out. I love Brian Hodge. I discovered him back in the I don't know early '90s, um, and back before the internet and the digital revolution. And his short story collections were hard to find, and I had to like really search them out. And I paid a pretty penny for a couple of them, but very worth it. I think he's one of the best working short story writers out there today.
Yeah, and you said that his short story collections are hard to find, or at least they were hard to find. If you have a Kindle or a Kindle reading app, they're not so hard to find now. But if you want the physical copies, they're still very, very hard to find.
Yeah, I was searching him out back before the digital book revolution. So, but I am very happy that you can find his stuff on digital now, so that people have more access to it. Because, I mean, just today on Twitter, somebody was talking about their favorite short story writers, so I recommended him because I definitely I have a lot of love for, I mean, all of his work, but particularly I think he excels in the short form.
Yeah, he has a lot of collections too. At least, well, more than four, I think. I
Yeah.
didn't sit down and count how many, but when I was looking him up to go grab a collection by him, I found a lot. Like there seemed to be a lot.
And I think he has another one forthcoming from Cemetery Dance sometime.
Very cool. I like those Cemetery Dance because you had a collection published by them, didn't you? It was like Allan Gunnell's collection, like sort of like a best of, right?
It was a digital only collection. I know I am talking with him about maybe one day putting out a paperback version of it, but that was exciting because they have a great reputation. I love short fiction. I was very happy they were willing to do that with me. It's called Curtain Call, and I think it has some really good stories in it.
I read that, I think, because I think that was one of the books that we talked with you, Michael Schutz and we talked with you on the Darkness Dwells podcast about that, I believe. I
Yeah, I
could be
think
wrong, but I know I read that, and I read it for like a purpose other than just pleasure reading. And I'm pretty sure it was for the Darkness Dwells podcast. And I remember, well, I always enjoy your short stories, so it was fun to read. And I remember talking to you about it, also saying, you got, you know, a dream gig there by getting published by Cemetery Dance and a collection at that.
Yeah, because I feel like everybody in the horror game knows Cemetery Dan. They publish some pretty big names, so um, it was an idea I pitched to them. At the time, Norman Prentice did their digital book line. Kevin Lucia actually does that now, but
Yeah.
also a very talented writer. But I was very happy when he said yes, and short stories are a passion of mine. I love the short form, so I'm always happy when I'm able to get a new collection out there.
I know that you love reading short stories. You love writing them, but I was wondering, whose short stories are you reading these days? Do you have any more good recommendations?
I recently read a collection called Whistling Past the Graveyard by Lex Jones, who is a British writer, and that was excellent. It had a very his style is very reminiscent of like the M.R. James stuff, but I mean obviously with a more modern approach to it. But it's that kind of classic horror ghost story kind of feel. And I also recently got to read an advanced reader's copy of a forthcoming collection from Michael Harris Cohen called Effects Vary. And that one is probably one of the best collections I've read in a long time. It's not due out. I don't think he has a firm date, but it's coming out later this year. And that one was absolutely excellent. And also, there is a collection called Ghost Summer by Tananarive Due, and I love that one as well. I've read some of her novels and I enjoy those too, but I felt she was particularly potent in that collection.
I read her book, The Good House, and I really like that. Ghost Summer has become a small but still somewhat of a booktube darling. A lot of people who've read that book on booktube and talked about it on booktube have uh have absolutely praised it. And so it's a collection I want to get to.
Yeah, it was very. I was very impressed by it.
Do you have any all-time favorite short stories?
I definitely. I mean, when somebody says, "What are your favorite short stories?" There are two that immediately come to mind. One is "In the Hills, the Cities" by Clive Barker, which is
That's a
kind
good
of
one.
a easy answer because I feel like almost everybody in the horror world says that, but it's just because it's an excellent story. It's completely, in one way, it takes a very familiar premise. Um, the bickering couple traveling around and they find themselves in an odd small town, but does something completely unexpected and original with it. And then what it does with it is so bizarre and weird, it almost shouldn't work,
Hmm.
but he makes it work. He sells it, and I just love that story. And the other one is by Brian Hodge, and it is called The Alchemy of the Throat. And it's sort of a take on vampirism, but it's not the traditional drinking blood vampire. But
Yeah.
but it's also like a weird but touching love story. Um, but I always recommend that one to people because it is so good. Um, I'm also a big fan of Stephen King's short stories, and he's done some that I absolutely loved. One of them I always really get a kick out of is called they've got a hell of a band,
Hmm.
which is again it's a very odd story but really works. And I really like some of his early short stories, A Night Shift and Skeleton Crew in particular. The
Yeah.
story he was writing before he was Stephen King when um, the
And
name.
his
But
stories were so much more angry back then.
yeah, I mean, and I'm not. Don't get me wrong. I've never not liked a Stephen King short story collection. I get excited when he's releasing one, but there's something very I don't know. There's a different feel to those early ones. I mean, like I feel like you can tell they're by a writer who's hungry and still like chasing the dream.
Yeah.
Um, but but yeah, I don't know. Short stories to me are just a delight. They're just like these little gut punches almost. But yeah, I love to read short stories. and I love to write them.
Do you think your love for short stories stems from the idea, or perhaps even the philosophy in horror fiction, that a lot of people believe, and myself included, that horror works better in a shorter form?
Um, I don't know. I think maybe more than any other genre, you can really go for the throat in a short story. Um, that can just be like a full speed ahead. Like I said, kind of a gut punch.
Yeah,
I mean, I do love a good lengthy horror novel too, where you really get to build character and suspense and layer all that in. Um, but there is just something about the short form, I guess because it's concentrated, um, you can get all that tension into that small space, and it makes it just feel all the more powerful.
yeah,
Um, so I do think horror lends itself very well, actually, to the short form.
I think so too. But like you, I also enjoy a longer piece if it's done well, because horror works, as I said, and it's not objectively works better as a shorter form. Uh, Horror doesn't necessarily have to be just one instance in someone's life, because someone's life could exist in horror. And I think the idea that horror is better in shorter form is just the idea of that one terrible thing that happened in someone's life, whether it's supernatural or not.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I hadn't really ever thought about that, but a lot of the times horror, even in a horror novel, it plays out in a condensed period of time. But yeah, there is something interesting about a horror that sustains over a long period of time.
Yeah,
Um,
I was kind of thinking of like Stephen King's It, those epic horror
yeah,
horror stories, like giants,
yeah.
bricks.
Sometimes I do enjoy one of those epic novels. I don't think I would ever be able to write one of those doorstops. Um, I feel like my mind is just more geared toward the shorter form, so even my novels are shorter novels. But as a reader, I just like stories across the board. And I
Yeah,
feel like some ideas are just naturally given to something longer, and some, are born to just be these little nuggets.
yeah. Are there any short stories that you return to and reread over again and over again?
I do go back and reread those first two early Stephen King collections, Night Shift and Graveyard Shift. I've definitely gone back and reread some of Clive Barker's Books of Blood. Um, there are some anthologies I read when I was younger that I want to go back and reread, that were like, that seemed seminal to me at the time. Um, because I can remember reading Under the Fang. I don't know if you've ever are familiar with that
Hmm.
anthology that I believe Robert McCammon edited it.
Yep.
It was
That
vampire
was,
fiction.
yeah, I
Yeah,
remember that. That came out in, like, I think, the 90s.
yeah. I
Yeah.
think when I was in college, and then John Skip and Craig Spector did the Books of the Blood
Yeah.
anthologies,
I actually have
and
the physical copies of those, and I'm kind of proud of that.
there was one called Shock Rock. I can't remember who edited that one, but it
Yeah.
was all like rock and roll based stories, which was
Yeah.
actually where Stephen King's story, They've Got a Hell of a Band, first appeared.
Hmm.
And so a great Brian Hodge story in there. But I keep wanting to go back, because when I remember reading those when I was younger and thinking, like, this is what I want to do, stories that are this good and that could be in these kinds of anthologies. Um, so I have not reread those yet, but those are some I plan to pull off the shelf soon.
Um, do you have any authors like, because Brian Hodge, as we were talking about, he's prolific in short stories, and pumping out the collections. Is there any horror writers out there who's like an auto buy for you when they release a collection of short stories?
Um, I mean, there's a lot. I'm always going to buy a new Stephen King story. I'm always going to buy a new Brian Hodge short story collection. I'm always going to buy a Joe Hill short story collection. I think he does very well.
Hmm.
Um, Paul Tremblay. Um, I don't know if she'll ever put another one out, but if Tanana Reed do put out another collection, I would definitely be buying that.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, short story collections are very. I mean, I've known people in my life who sort of get. Oh, Neil Gaiman is another one. I always buy one of his short story collections. But I've known people who they see a writer they like is releasing a collection, and they almost get disappointed that it's not like a novel. But I get very excited.
Yeah.
And often, if there's a writer I want to try, if I haven't sampled their work yet, the first thing I do is see if they have a collection out, because I usually want to start there because I feel it's going to give me a wider view of what they can do.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I discovered Mike Thorne last year. Well, he just started releasing books. He released 2 collections last year alone, and they were just phenomenal, especially the first one. Actually, I think he released that one with a smaller press in like 2017 or 18 or something like that. But yeah, I really fell in love with those books. Um, but going back to you, Mark, you released a collection recently. And of course, I'm talking about Tales from the Typewriter. I read that in preparation for this, and it was really fun to read. I wasn't sure what to expect going into it. I knew it had an interesting wraparound, but I wasn't prepared for what I got because it really reminded me of like Tales from the Crypt, without resembling it exactly or anything like that. It actually resembled maybe more of like oh, what's it called? The Vault of Horror, um, if anything, with the wraparound, because the wraparound didn't have like a ghoulish half, or something that's been dead for 20 years. But it did have an interesting wraparound. Uh, so did you have those anthology movies in mind at all when you put this collection together?
Um, Not exactly, but I was approached by Unnerving Press, and they asked if I wanted to do a short collection for their Rewind or Die series. And his only, you know, caveats about that were the stories needed to be thematically linked somehow, and he wanted a wraparound story that sort of weaved between them and tied it all together. Well, whenever somebody asks if I want to do a collection, the answer is always going to be yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of short stories. So even though I have released quite a few collections, I always know I'm going to be able to pull together enough for a collection. So I looked through to see what kind of thematic elements I could, bring. And I realized I did have quite a few stories that dealt with writing and writers. And I thought that would be interesting. And then immediately I had an idea for a story about someone who buys an old manual typewriter that's haunted, and at night it just starts typing on its own. And when he puts paper in it. So I thought this would be the perfect concept for the wraparound. And then what it's printing out when he puts the paper in are the stories in there. And I had, I guess, more than those anthology movies, I was thinking about things like the Books of Blood by Barker or the Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury, where they had these wraparounds that sort of, and John Skip and Craig Spector did one like that called Deadlines.
Hmm.
So I guess I was thinking more along those lines, but it was kind of fun because I already had the stories, but then I wrote the wraparound specifically to fit in between them, and that was a fun. I mean, I've done that two other times in collections, but it's always kind of fun to make that story a cohesive whole, so it doesn't feel like filler, but actually feels like a solid structure on its own.
I thought that maybe you were writing with the wraparound. I thought maybe you were writing about yourself too. If you were to die, you would probably haunt a typewriter, and you would pump out the stories at night of people put in paper.
Well, I can't imagine ever not writing stories. I would hope that, I wasn't quite as for anybody who reads Tales from the Typewriter, you know, the writer who's continuing to write beyond his death has a bitter streak.
Yeah, he's
But I feel
he's
like
not a
I
happy
feel like
person, no.
mine's a little more joyous. But
Yeah, yeah.
but it was it's always kind of fun to, because since they're my short stories, but I'm creating this fictional wraparound where they're another writer's short stories. In some ways, that writer has to be me a little bit because the stories I'm saying he wrote are my stories.
Yeah, and by you being in the story, all I mean was that you would haunt either a word processor somewhere or a typewriter. That would be Allan
Well,
Gunnells just continuing with the stories even though he's gone.
I do love. I know you can't see it very well, but I have an old Royal manual typewriter
Well,
that I
there
keep
you go.
displayed in my office. That I bought at an antique shop, which is actually what gave me the idea for what eventually became the wraparound story.
I can see there's paper in there, so you're all set to go.
Yes, there is paper in there. So far, no ghosts have typed any stories while I've been sleeping, but fingers crossed.
Oh, you mentioned how bitter that writer is, who's haunting the typewriter. I think that bitterness really comes out in The King of Halloween. Now, I was wondering if you fashioned that writer, the character of that writer, from Stephen King at all, and not because of the name King, but because there were a couple of similarities between the writing. I don't think Stephen King is a bitter person at all, none of that stuff. But there was just other certain characteristics that I was like, oh, this seems like it's Stephen King, and then the story went completely dark, and I'm like, yeah, it's not Stephen King anymore.
Um, I didn't model it after Stephen King, but actually, I was the the original kernel of that idea came from, I think, an interview I saw with Stephen King from either the late '80s or the early '90s, where he talked about how people expected him to really pull out all the stops at Halloween because he was the horror guy. And I remember watching that and thinking, like, does he get sick of that? Does he just want to let Halloween pass where he doesn't have to put on this display for people?
Yeah,
And that just got my mind turning in that direction. And that's kind of how that story ended up being born.
yeah, that was actually part of what made me think of Stephen King's. That I heard Stephen King say, "I hate Halloween," and it was funny because we were talking about that before. But he hates Halloween. I think part of the reason was because he used to do trick or treating at his house, and he used to get like really long lineups. And I'm sure that, as you were mentioning there, I'm sure that got really old. He had to
Yeah.
stop, so yeah, he had to close those big iron gates.
Yeah.
Oh, another story that really struck me was identity theft, because it's an interesting concept in that story. And I was wondering if you do what the main character in that does, the writer. Do you go around and not necessarily intentionally, but I know some people who intentionally eavesdrop on other people, and they it's a way you sort of absorb how people talk. Do you ever find yourself eavesdropping on what people are saying around you when you're outside?
Sometimes. And that particular story, which I think might be, I think it is, it's the oldest story in there. I mean, I wrote that one actually many years ago. Um, but I got it because I always tell people, if you know me, something you say or some story you tell me is probably going to end up in a book somewhere. Not like your your autobiographical life, but I steal phrases or gestures or quirks from the people around me. Obviously, the people I know well, I spend the most time with. So, my husband might read one of my books and be like, "Oh, that came from when we were talking about this topic." But I do that also with strangers. Like I'll just be out somewhere, there'll be a certain look that a person has, or a certain way they have of walking, or a certain phrase they say that I just kind of squirrel away in my brain and then pop it in there. I went to a concert one time many years ago, and there were two teenage girls a few rows ahead of us, and the opening act was Bauhaus, Bela Lugosi's Dead,
Mm-hmm.
and those teenage girls were singing along with all the songs, and my friend said, you know, those girls weren't even alive when these songs were written.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I just thought I'm going to write a story about these girls. I didn't know what it was yet, but like I sort of memorized what they were wearing, gestures they made, and I did end up writing a story called Revolution of Sound, um, with them in it. Obviously, I didn't know anything about them personally, but still, I borrowed from them. And
Yeah.
the story I didn't have originally I was calling it Borrowed Lives. But yeah, so I took that concept and I thought, well, what could I do with this in a story? And that was what I came up with.
Very cool. I've actually known people, and I've probably participated in this myself, who make a game of when you see people walking through the mall or something and trying to figure out who they are exactly, and you come up with stories with
Yeah.
where they're coming from and where they're going. And obviously you're
Yeah.
wrong,
I mean,
but
well, we don't always know. We don't follow them
yeah,
home.
that's true.
They could,
You
we
might
can
be
do
right.
exactly. But I think creative people just do that. Like everything is a potential story or can be potentially used in a story. So it's a disclaimer I always give people I know. Like, don't, I'm not going to put you. I mean, well, I take that back. Every now and again, I put people just as themselves into my stories and cameos, but I always ask permission. And but yeah. So it's just the creative mind. We're always trying to turn everything into a story.
Awesome. I have a quote from a book here I wanted to read. Is it okay if I read just a little
Sure.
bit, because I thought it was an interesting. It speaks on a very big truth on uh, writers of today and writers of yesterday. And I believe it's from King of Halloween.
Okay.
It was what was wanted from him was not discussion on style, theme, or character development. No, his students wanted him to teach how to write formulaic novels, how to emulate the latest best-selling authors. Originality and creativity were archaic concepts. These days, it was all about fitting your writing into niche markets and riding the coattails of others' success. I found this quote to be very, very true, especially when you're like going through all the tutorials, the writing tutorials that you find on YouTube, and a lot of the writing courses that I've heard about. That's what it's geared to. It's geared to you selling stories. I was wondering what your thoughts are on all this. Not because that was the negative guy from that story, but I want to know what Mark thinks about this.
Well, and I think that actually came from the story in there, Dr. Champ.
Okay.
Um, and and I and that was sort of born from the idea that I do think I don't know if it's really what the readers want, but I think the big publishers think that the readers want the same kind of books over and over and over again. And they're looking for, and most best-selling authors have talked a little bit about the fact that, if you get successful doing one thing, the publisher wants you just to keep doing that thing.
Mm-hmm.
They're not really interested in experimentation or branching out or trying different things. And so I was just sort of extrapolating that in my head. I actually think, I mean, there's nothing wrong with a formula novel. They can be fun, they can be entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
If there's someone who just enjoys writing those kind of formula novels, I'm not saying they shouldn't. But I do think readers, not all of them, but by and large, readers do respond well when writers try different things, when they go outside their comfort zones. I think it can be exciting for readers. But I think, again, small press is a different world, but the larger, like New York publishers, I do think they want to keep their writers sort of contained. And that's why sometimes if you look at the bestsellers list, you do see a lot of the same names and a lot of the same types of books. Um, and I think part of that is because that's what is being produced by New York Publishing. And when you get something that's very different, it's almost treated like this revolutionary upset, like something that's not the same old thing made it onto the bestsellers list, but then they
Mhm.
just try to turn that new thing into a formula.
Yeah.
Um, so I that was what I was channeling in that story, and there was actually a story I cut from the collection just for length, called the Poe 3000, which was about a future where all books are written by programs that just do certain formulas with slight variation over and over. So that is something I think about sometimes. And it's one of the reasons I love being in the small press, because I feel like they do give you the room to try a lot of different things. Um, and there's so many different small presses that specialize that, you can, this one's not right for this publisher, you can try there. But I feel like almost the more successful you get, the more pressure there is to narrow your focus.
Yeah. Those big New York publishers, the bottom line for them is to stay alive, and what feeds their company is ultimately money, right? And so they need to follow what works. And so it's kind of a special and rare thing when that book you talk about, that book that nobody's ever really read before, hits the New York Times bestseller list, and then everyone else starts copying it. But it's true, like the writers. I find this is interesting because writers, like fantasy writers, I'm thinking of, are people who write series of books, especially with those top publishers. They often get stuck writing in a series that's doing really well, and they're told to write more in that series and expand their original idea into something that's bigger when they didn't necessarily have that and as planned in the first place. And so writers tend to take a lot of flack for what the publishers want,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate, but
Um, and like I said, I know Robert McCammon has talked about his trouble with his publishers when he wanted to branch away from just horror. I mean, obviously, Stephen King's Misery is a book that talks a lot about that pressure to just keep producing the same thing over and over.
yeah.
Reaction you can get when you try to break away from that. So, I mean, I definitely think it's something that a lot of writers have on their mind.
Yeah. Now, what would you have as advice for any writer who feels that they're not writing in that type of form at all, and they feel that maybe there's no place for their stories in the world?
Um, I mean, the great thing about it is there's a place for every story in the world, because if you're writing something that's not like the other stuff out there, there is an audience for that if you can get to them. And that audience feels deprived. That audience feels like if they're not looking for the popular thing that's everywhere, that they're not getting what they need out of a story. And I mean, the truth of the matter is, everything I have ever published, I've had at least one person who felt the need to tell me, I don't like that. Like, I don't like vampires. I don't like
Hmm.
zombies. I don't like short story collections. I don't, you know, so I'm not going to read that. So I'm
I
like,
don't
well,
like
I mean,
horror.
you're
Get
not
that a lot of
obligated.
it.
So, the thing is, you're never going to please everybody. So don't worry about it. Just write the story you want to tell, and then try to find a way to get it to the audience that likes that sort of thing. Um, and I don't want this to sound negative, but we're not all going to be Stephen King.
Hmm.
So if that's your goal, then I don't know that I can talk to you, because my goal isn't to be Stephen King. My goal is to write the stories that I'm passionate about and get them published. And I might not have a huge readership, but I feel like I've found a readership that is interested in the types of things I'm interested in telling. So I just say, always go with your gut, always follow your passions, write the stories that interest you, and don't worry about getting this, universal approval because you're never going to get it. I mean,
Hmm.
Stephen King doesn't get it.
Yeah.
There are always going to be people who they're not your target audience. So just make yourself your target audience first.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that, honestly. Um, Although there are people who can and have fun doing the formulaic thing. There's a couple of even independent writers, self-published writers who have built like they, far as I know, they make a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money off of writing series, and it's all formulaic stuff. But they seem to really love doing it, and I say all the power to you. But if you enjoy writing the stuff that nobody's ever like reading it and you're like, wow, this is way out there, but it's good, you know? So I've read some of that too. And it's just that's the stuff I gravitate towards anyway.
And that's why I always say celebrate all writers, even the ones who aren't writing what you want to read. Because,
Hmm.
like if somebody's writing something that isn't my cup of tea, if that's what brings them joy, if that's what they take pleasure in writing, then I don't have to be the target audience for it to celebrate that they're doing what makes them happy.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, you also have a novella coming out soon. And I haven't read this one yet, but I'm going to read it when it comes out. You always send me like e-copies of your book, like even the typewriter, Tales from the Typewriter. You sent me a copy of that, but I just went and bought it anyway because I like supporting writers. And but you have a novella coming out soon. Can you tell us the name of it and what it's about?
It is called When It Rains, and it's coming out on March 25th from Crystal Lake Publishing. And When It Rains is it's an interesting book. I wrote it in the very early stages of the pandemic. Those first 2 months, I got furloughed from work, and I needed something to channel my anxiety into so that I could keep it manageable. Um, and I had this idea, which was based on this weird instance that happened in the 90s in Washington State, where there was a small town where just this weird rain fell that was actually more gelatinous and almost slimy. And no one has ever quite figured out what it was. There were a lot of theories that were never proven. And some people, although there's been some doubt about this, some people said they got sick from having contact with the substance that rained down on the city. So I was
Interesting.
thinking about that, and I was thinking, well, what if this happened on a global scale? What if this slimy rain started falling all over the world at the same time? Um, and I thought it could be a story that talked about paranoia, the way we let fear control us, um, and obviously, even though I didn't consciously try to think of it this way, but there were some parallels to the way the world handled the pandemic.
Hmm.
Um, and I thought, even though I'm going to make this happen on a global scale, I'm going to focus the story in on a little microcosm. So I set it in a college campus bookstore, which was based on the bookstore where I work, and just have these characters who are dealing with this. They don't know what's happening. They're starting to get paranoid. They're worried that the people who are caught in the rain are going to get sick. Um, and I just thought, this will be a good story to focus my mind for these 2 months. And I mean, it worked out. I finished it the week before I ended up going back to work. And right as I finished it, Crystal Lake announced that they were opening up for submissions for novellas. So I'm like, the timing worked out perfectly for me.
Yeah. Awesome. I can't wait to read it. It sounds because it's on such a global scale. Did you have to do much research for it, or was the research kind of happening in real life while you were writing it?
Well, I mean, I focused a lot more on the character reactions. And that was, like I said, I drew a lot from what was actually happening in the world, what I know of human nature. Um, I did try to bring in the more global aspect. The story is sort of interjected in places with excerpts from a book that's written sometime in the future about the event, and that's where you get more of what's happening in the rest of the world. Um, I mean, I did do a little research on a few things, but mostly I kept it very contained because what interests me in a lot of horror is the human reaction to it, how people react to it, who reacts with heroism, who reacts with paranoia and greed, and who turns on each other, and who actually rises to the occasion. And I think a lot of horror, I know zombie fiction does this very well too, is you take the more otherworldly element just so you can explore human nature, and that's kind of what I was doing with this story.
Very cool. So well, I just want to mention that this video is dropping on the release day. I'll have links down there in the darkness, as I like to call it, where you can go and purchase it. And I can't wait to read it myself. Now, you write a lot. I mean, period. But you write a lot of short stories. I know that short story writing is your favorite medium, but you also write a lot in novellas. Would you say that's your second favorite medium to write in?
Um, Possibly. The thing about the novella is it's a perfect sort of middle ground. Um, I feel like you're getting all the strengths of the short story and all the strengths of the novel in the novella, because it gives you a little more room, so you can uh, put in more character development, you can put in more backstory, you can put in um, more a more gradual build, but it's still short enough that it is that very concentrated um, rush to the end. So I do feel like the novella is uniquely special in that it takes the strength of the two other forms and sort of melds them. So I think I love writing novellas. I love reading novellas also for that reason, because I feel like it is really built and designed to give you just enough, but give it to you in a quick. I mean, most novellas I've read, I can still read basically in a day.
Mhm.
So, but it feels more expansive without sort of belaboring the point, if that makes any sense.
Makes perfect sense. A lot of writers who write longer form novels often you see it in reviews all the time, where people are like, "This could have been shortened. This could have been edited down." That's one thing I don't really complain about that. If I'm reading a book and I'm enjoying it, I don't care if you go on about this side trip for 50 pages or 100 pages. I'm like, let's do it if it's good, right? If I'm enjoying myself. But a lot of people don't always like that. And the one thing I like about novellas is it's always sort of to the point,
Yeah.
and none of the fat, really.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is there are critics of the novella form, because I don't think they understand that it's its own form. Like, I'll see reviews for a novella that will say, well, they should have just, added some more to make it a novel, or they should have cut some of it out to make it a short story. And I'm like, well, no, it's not a short story. It's not a novel. It's a novella. And I feel like as a reader, I can tell when a writer has taken a novella and just added padding
Hmm.
to get the word count for it to be
Up
considered
to,
a novel.
yeah.
And it really is its own thing, and it has its own requirements, and just adding more to it to make it long enough to be a novel, or cutting stuff out so it'll be a short story, that damages the story, because it really, I think stories tell you how long they need to be, and some
Yes.
stories are novellas, and I think you're doing a disservice to the story and ultimately to the readers, and definitely to yourself as a storyteller, when you don't listen to the story telling you how long it needs to be.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree with that. Um, I like it when a story is as long as it should be. But sometimes a novel will kind of go some other direction, and if like I said, if it works though, then at least to me, like, I'm not saying if it works, that's objectively it works and everyone will think the same. No, if it works for me, then I'm good with going there. But I've often dropped novels because I just didn't know what it's like, where are you going with this? Because you're going in all these different directions, and I'm bored or confused in a bad way. And because I like being confused, I read a lot of weird or I used to read a lot of weird fiction. So obviously, I like being confused. But yeah,
And it's not always about length either. Like I've read 1,000-page novel where it felt almost like I didn't want it to end, and I've read
yeah,
like a 400-page novel where I'm like, well, this is too long
and it's never
because
gonna end.
yeah, it's just about again the story's needs, and I know what you mean. Like I like to be confused in a story where there's a payoff, like,
Hmm.
and then it makes sense. I kind of like that feeling of I don't know what is going on yet, but there has to be the payoff. If the story stops and I'm still like I don't know what was going on, that's not
Yeah.
good. But during the reading of it, I like a story that has so much mystery to it that at times I'm not quite sure. Because I think we've all read stories and seen movies where we can see, miles away where it's headed.
Hmm.
Um, and I know I've watched movies with my husband where I'm like, oh, well, he's going to do that and she's going to do this, and that's how we'll end up there. So I like it when a story has me kind of, you know, in that area where I don't know where it's going. And I can't predict, and I'm not sure where the author is leading me, because that can be very exciting and cool.
Yeah, one of my favorite things is when a short story or a novella. I don't think I could read like 1,000-page novel like this, and I know they exist, but novellas, and short stories that play with reality and what reality means and how slippery it can be. And that's where my love of weird fiction comes from. And a lot of the short stories I love are often classed as weird fiction. I know that you really like Twilight type stories, which you could class into a style of weird fiction.
Twilight type stories?
Sorry,
You
Twilight
mean the
Zone.
Stephanie Meyer story?
Yeah. No, like
Okay,
Twilight
yeah,
Zone
I was going to
stories.
say
Yeah, no, I'm
I
not
I
talking
am
about. I'm not. Yeah, I'm not talking about the
I'm not
sparkly
one of
vampires.
those writers who is going to condemn Stephanie Meyer. She does her thing.
Yeah,
I've seen interviews with her. She clearly loves what she does. But
yeah,
yeah, but the Twilight Zone, that's my sweet spot when it comes to horror. And I
yeah.
don't know if it's just because, that was some of the first horror I saw. I grew up watching the original Twilight Zone and
Me
the
too. Yeah,
80s. And I love those kinds of stories. And it is that kind of, it's our world, but things are just slightly off kilter,
yeah.
um, enough to really, get you off balance. And I've always loved that. And I feel like my short stories in particular often have a very Twilight Zone feel to them.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, to the point where I can't say too much about it, but I will have another collection coming out down the road where the publisher specifically asked me to collect my most Twilight Zoney stories. Um, but yeah, that had a huge influence on how I viewed horror, and I still like that more subtle, ambiguous horror.
Hmm.
Um, Nothing wrong with the more extreme stuff, and some of that I really love too. But I like I said, my sweet spot is that Twilight Zone kind of horror. So it's been a huge influence on my writing.
Yeah. Twilight Zone. I want to reiterate that I wasn't like making a dig at Twilight at all. I don't know how I forgot the zone of Twilight Zone, but you know what? Honestly, I read the first Twilight book and I thought it was okay. Like, I don't see why everyone was crapping all over it so much.
I actually read it too. I did this sort of personal project where I wanted to read what I called the literary phenomenon books of my lifetime.
Hmm.
Even if they weren't things like I read The Bridges of Madison County, and I read The Da Vinci Code, and I read Twilight. And, I I wasn't that book's target audience, but I also didn't think it was particularly bad. And
Yeah.
I liked it enough that I read one of her non-Twilight books, The Chemist, and I loved that one.
Hmm.
I thought that one was just pure fun. Um, but that's what I'm always saying. Like, there's room for everyone. Like, I think and sometimes I'm even guilty of this. We get in this mindset where we're supposed to be the target audience for everything that's made.
Yeah.
And so, like, we get, because sometimes I feel like the reaction to certain things is anger. Like, how dare
Hmm.
they make this thing that wasn't made for me? I'm like,
Yeah.
well, maybe it was made for the person next to you. So
Hmm.
just chalk it up to, well, that one wasn't for me, but I'm glad people are enjoying. Like, anytime something is popular, I see those people who almost get upset
Yeah.
because I'm like, well, you're not going to like everything. It's not a personal attack on you. So
Yeah.
I because I even see that in reviews of other works. I've seen it in some reviews of my work where it's like, this is what the writer should have done to make it a story I would like. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, I'm not writing it specifically for you. Like, we all think we are the only person it should be written for, but I'm going off on a tangent, I know, but
No.
I just really feel like you can dislike something and it not be a big deal, and you don't
Hmm.
have to, you know, cast aspersions on the people who do like it as if there's something wrong with them because they have a different, you know, taste in things. But I'm just all about celebrating story. I'm excited that anybody is telling stories, and everyone should
And
tell the
people,
stories that are
yeah.
the most them.
And I think, things like Twilight are great because it introduces people to reading. And
Yeah,
after they're done with the Twilight series, I've seen this like just by watching other people's booktube channels, people who started out reading Twilight or
yeah.
other young adult stuff that some people don't like, but they finished those series and they wanted more, and so they started reading more, and it led to where we all are now sometimes. And
I
I
think
have like mad respect for that.
Yeah, because when I grew up, there wasn't actually. I don't even think they had a category they called young adult.
Yeah, they didn't.
Um,
Not really,
so,
anyway.
I mean, there were novels that would probably now be called young adult, but they didn't really have that sort of marketing terminology for it.
Yeah.
Um, so, when I went to the library when I was a kid, there was the children section, and then there was the adult section.
Hmm.
Now at the library, there is children, young adult, adult.
Yeah.
Um, but I feel like because there wasn't really that middle category, there wasn't as much judgment. Because, I think if teens are enjoying that, that's great. I, as an adult, enjoy some things that are called YA.
Hmm.
Um, and sometimes I always remember there was a Neil Gaiman book called The Graveyard Book that was originally released as a YA book.
Hmm.
And then the publisher, when they realized that it had an adult readership, they released the adult version, which was the exact same book with a different cover.
Hmm. Yeah.
Because it is like that, you know, crossover where like is which one is it? You can call it either. Um, I know I released a book one time called Outcast that I didn't think of it as a YA book. The publisher didn't publish it as a YA book, but almost all the reviews called it a YA book. And I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
like I'll take it.
It's just
Doesn't
like that. Just like Clown in a Field by Adam Caesar. They marketed that as YA, but when you read it, there's no way it's YA. But I'm glad they marketed it towards YA because of the messages that are in the book. But
yeah.
but there's some awful things that go on in that story. Clown in a Cornfield. I can't speak today. I keep messing up titles.
That's right. It's Clown in the Twilight.
Yeah, Clown in the Twilight. I like that. Okay, so going back to novellas, I was wondering if you have any favorite writers who you feel really nail novella writing, especially in the horror genre.
Um, I hate to keep mentioning. Well, I don't hate to keep mentioning, but I keep mentioning Clive Barker. But he wrote one of my all-time favorite novellas, which is The Hellbound Heart, which was the basis of his movie Hellraiser.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think that's almost a perfect novella. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there, I'm blanking on the name of this author. Give me 1 second. I'm going to look it up because I want to get her name right.
I'm no longer alone in the blanking of names.
Let's see. Let's see if I can find it right fast. But there's a novella called Illyria. Elizabeth Hand. That's the name of the author.
Okay, yeah, I know that author.
But it is. I don't know how to describe it. Magic realism. But it was a beautiful novella. And you know how else? I mean, she's mostly known for her novels, but Sarah Pinborough has done some really great novellas as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think Stephen King does great novellas. His novella collections to me are as good as his short story collections.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, what other novellas have I read that really blew me away lately? And sometimes it's tricky because I feel like, because I mentioned there is sometimes a criticism of the form, or I feel like sometimes publishers want to call something a short novel and not a novella,
Yeah.
even though it's the same length. So it's just the title that puts some people off, which is always
Yeah.
interesting to me.
Well, the
Um,
funny thing is the big five publishers that we were talking about before, they don't really publish novellas. They don't like them. They want thicker pieces. But if an author like Stephen King has like a bunch of novellas, they often do what Stephen King often does, and that's publish like 4 or 5 of them in one volume.
but even sometimes, like, I told you I read The Bridges of Madison County. That's just a
Hmm.
novella. They
Yeah,
didn't
it's very short.
market
Yeah.
it. And I know Anne Rice once published two smaller vampire books called Pandora and Vittorio the Vampire.
I
And I
love.
saw an interview where she was saying, like, I mean, these are really just novellas, but the publisher wants to call them short novels.
Yeah.
Because again, it's not the length that necessarily puts some people off. It's just that title.
Hmm.
Like, it's it's just so interesting to me. They'll say they don't like novellas, but if they'll read something the same length as long as it's not called a novella. But
Yeah.
that's another topic for another day. But there's also a some small press writers, James Newman and Aaron Dries, also do some really great novellas
Yeah.
as well.
You wrote a book with Aaron Dries, a
Yeah,
novella, I believe, right?
now that I think of it, I've written novellas with both James Newman and Aaron Dries.
Oh,
But that's
James
not why
Newman.
I
Yeah.
mentioned them. They're solo novellas. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's funny. But yeah, honestly, I've really over the years I've really come to love reading novellas. There's so many reasons why. One, I've already mentioned, it's usually it packs the story into one neat little package that really often packs a punch. But they're also really good for your Goodreads challenge at the end of the year if you're lagging behind at all.
And a really good one I read last year was Things Have Gotten Worse Since Last We Spoke by Eric LaRocca.
Yes.
Um, and I know a
I-
lot, that's nominated for a Stoker. Everyone's talking about that one. But that's one of those where I'm like, one, I don't think that kind of energy could have been sustained in a novel,
No.
but definitely it needed more room to breathe than a short story.
Hmm.
And it's one of those where it's almost hard to even describe what it's about. It's so uniquely its own thing,
Yeah.
and I'm so glad that something like that found a wider audience that way.
Yeah, that
But
really blew up.
yeah,
I read it last year as well, and I loved it.
yeah,
I was supposed to be talking with Eric yesterday, incidentally, but he had to cancel because he apparently got sick. But But I really miss that we missed that opportunity to talk. But hopefully we can reschedule.
Yeah, I don't know him very well, but I've had some interaction with him. But that novella really was one of the my top reads from last year,
It was
and
very
I
powerful and
really good stuff.
disturbing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was fantastic. I don't recommend the audiobook though if you can read it on either as an ebook or because of the date and the time. Sometimes the messages that were being sent in the book were much shorter than the dates and the time, and there would be a long string of them. And so listening somebody read that out to you, it got a little monotonous, but I still really enjoyed the book. So I would honestly, I'd recommend print or ebook for that. But it kind of reminded me of a Joe Hill story too, not content wise, like within the story, but in the presentation, because Joe Hill wrote that one story that was like all Twitter tweets.
zombie story. Yeah, I forgot what it was
Yeah,
called, but
that was very good too. It was just a short story, but this one takes place in like private messaging,
yeah.
that just sort of using modern media, the way we communicate these days, and seeing it appear in short stories and novels and whatnot is kind of fascinating to me.
I mean, it is kind of a modern take on the. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, but the epistolary novel.
Yeah,
Because Dracula was one like that's all like letters or journal entries.
yeah,
But I'm seeing more and more. I've even written a few. There's one in Tales from the Typewriter
hmm,
where it's all emails and posts
yeah,
online and comments and I do think we're just taking those classic forms and reinterpreting them for the modern world, which is one of my delights in the horror fiction. I One of my focuses. I mean, it's not conscious, but I recognize it when I look at my work. Is I love to take the classic horror tropes that I grew up with and reinterpret them for the modern world, reinterpret them through an LGBT lens. Um, I just love playing with the old ideas and doing something new and fresh with them.
how do you accomplish subverting those old ideas into something new? Do you do it consciously, or do you find yourself doing it unconsciously while you're writing the work?
I can't say it's super conscious, but I think what I like to do, particularly as a member of the LGBT community, is I grew up not seeing myself reflected in the fiction that I loved in the horror genre. Um, so most of my stuff really is born from character. I like to develop the character, and then however that character would react is how the story is going to go. So I find that when I put characters in a familiar horror situation that aren't characters you've necessarily ever seen in that situation before, who they are as people, their past experiences, they may react differently than the characters we're used to seeing. And that's going to sort of knock the story off into a different trajectory. So I find that I use character to sort of reinterpret the stories by letting you see the story through eyes that haven't historically been represented much in the genre.
Yeah. All right. So I've reached the end of my questions. I was wondering if you have any other short story collections or novellas that you would like to recommend. I've read a few of your recommendations because we always talk about somewhat like recommendations because I always, I don't know why, but I'm always bugging you when you're on my show for this type of stuff. So do you have anything you'd like to recommend?
I mean, really, the ones I recommended earlier, I definitely check out "Whistling Past the Graveyard" by Lex Jones, and again, I'll be posting it all over my social media when it's out. But when Michael Harris Cohen's "Effects Vary" come out, that I think that's going to be just an all-time great collection. Um, I also, like I said, I recommend the Eric LaRocca book. Um, there was also I'm doing that thing again where I can't remember. Haley
Might be an
Piper has
aging
a
thing.
novella out. Seth, what was that?
I said it might be an aging thing. I don't know.
You broke up on me.
Oh, it just might be an aging thing. Or we're I think we're both the exact
Well,
same age, so if I remember correctly.
I might be getting old. I don't remember the name of Haley Piper had a novella out last year that I liked so much, and now I can't think of the name of it. And that's driving me crazy.
Haley Piper. Who's that? No,
Are
just
you
kidding.
familiar with Haley Piper?
Yes, I talk about her all the time on my channel. So I was making sort of an inside
Um,
joke there with who's that? Let me see.
the
Yeah,
one.
but
That's
oh, the warrant. Yeah, I read that
the
too.
one.
That was brilliant. It's a really good piece of cosmic horror. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, and it had some great character work in it, and just and it was one of those stories that also gave you information piecemeal, so you maybe like what we were talking about before, like you don't have all the information up front, but you have just enough to intrigue you to keep going.
Hmm.
But yeah, I definitely recommend that one as well. And I apologize that I blanked on the name for so long.
Don't worry, but you know what? It must be just the type of day. It's in the air or something. Because
Luckily, I'm right next to my trusty computer, so I can look this stuff up.
yeah, I'm on my computer talking to you, but I have my cell phone, so I can look things up too. All
Well,
right, so
I'm recording on my phone using my computer.
yeah. So do you you have these two releases that we talked about? Uh, one was out in February, I believe, or early, yeah, February, right? The Tales from the Typewriter.
Late, but yeah.
Yeah. And the new one is coming out. Well, it's dropping today, technically, as long as I get the video out at the right time. um, do you have anything else coming out this year that you'd like to share with us?
I'm going to have another novel out at the end of the year. I think October is what we are aiming for. Called Lucid, which is a very bizarre novel that takes place almost entirely in dreams.
Cool.
And then I wrote a novella for Crystal Lake. For they're going to be putting out collections of novellas with different authors. Like I'll be in there with two other authors.
Cool.
But I don't know if that's coming out this year or not. But Lucid is definitely supposed to be out sometime late fall.
I think you posted a lot about the writing of that on social media. I remember you talking about Lucid a lot, if I
Yeah,
remember correctly.
I tend to, especially when I'm writing a longer piece, um, talk about it a lot online because it helps keep me motivated in an odd way to let people know what I'm working on and where I'm at. It somehow it energizes me to keep going.
I kind of like that because when you get down to reading the book, you're like, I was kind of following
Yeah.
along the backstory a little bit. All right. So speaking of social medias, where can people find you?
I'm in all the usual places: Facebook, Mark Allan Gunnells. I'm on Twitter at Mark A Gunnells. I'm on Instagram. Make reading cool again is my moniker on there. Um, and that's I also have a blog, markgunnells.livejournal.com, which I update once in a while. Um, but uh, but yeah, I'm not. I'm too old for the TikToky, Snapchatty. But
You know, you should join TikTok. It's pretty easy to create or to build an audience there right now.
well, the only thing I know about
Aaron
TikTok.
Dries is on there. He
Oh,
he
really?
he. Oh yeah, he has like a lot of recommendation videos. I love watching his little recommendation videos.
I mean, all I know about TikTok is one, it don't stop, and two, that most of the. I mean, this may be outdated now, but most of the TikTok videos I saw were young people doing kind of lackadaisical dance moves to
Hmm.
odd choreography. but I'm sure there's a much wider world. But I'm old. I'm frightened of new things. I'll have to get my toes into it before
Well,
I.
it's like it's like YouTube. YouTube was known for having videos of people flying off roofs and shopping carts. So, but now there's this whole intellectual side to it, or that intellectual side of it was probably always there. It's just the people flying off rooftops and shopping carts is much more, entertaining, and it's obviously going to.
Gets the eyeballs on it.
The problem with TikTok though is you have TikTok will try to figure out an algorithm of what you like and display to you what they think you like. But you're still going to find those dance things and the things that you don't like. And there's no choosing. The biggest problem with TikTok is you just have to keep scrolling through. There's no really choosing of the type of stuff you want to see. But yeah, Aaron Dries is on there, and he has a lot of really good recommendation of horror books that he thinks that are good, and I enjoy watching those. There's a few other horror writers on there. The thing is, like Book Talk, I was in my bookstore the other day, just shopping, and I saw a table. I made a short about it on my channel, and I also uploaded it to TikTok. But I saw a table there saying recommended on TikTok. And my short little video was like, how come we don't see recommended on BookTube? Because BookTube's, it's a thing. But I just found that interesting. There's like a whole table of books. Book Talk is actually big enough to infiltrate the
I
bookstores.
work at a well, I work at a university bookstore, and they recently sent us display signs for any displays we wanted to make, and one of them is Book Talk. But I just put that one aside for right now. I'm like, well, I don't know anything about that, so I'll use some of these others.
Yeah. That's pretty cool though. That something like that is actually making waves in the reading community. 'Cause, it's the same thing. It's getting people to read, and that's always a good thing. All
Yeah,
right.
anything that promotes is good with me.
Yeah, me too. All right, so I want to thank you for coming on, and you have an open pass anytime you want to come on. Just let me know, and we'll discuss some books. It's one of my favorite. I don't really have too many people in my real life that I can talk about books with. I do talk about books with my wife, but we both read different types of books, and
Yeah.
so if I'm talking about a book that I find really amazing, she's like, "Oh, okay, cool, yeah." And it's the same thing if she's you can't really get into a conversation about that because it's always just sort of one-sided. She likes like uh more romantic type stuff, and I yeah, obviously I like the horror and science fiction and fantasy. So it's always cool to talk books with people, and I always enjoy talking with you. So thanks for coming on, Mark.
Okay, thank you. I always have a good time.
And good luck with your book releases. And as I said, we'll talk to you again.